Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Jahaan Podcast. I'm Maheen Qureshi, and I'm super excited to have Deepa Iyer with me today. Deepa, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Maheen.
So, everyone, I wanted to let you know how I know Deepa. That's usually how I like to start off the conversation. And every session is really unique and important, and this particular one has great meaning to me. So many years ago, in post 9/11 America, as a corporate professional working in outreach in the space of economic development, I got to know Deepa through an organization that she was leading in the South Asian American social justice space, working at the national level here in the United States, at the table in Washington, D.C., and working really closely with grassroots organizations all around the country. And as I say this, I'm actually getting chills. And I think this is because it was so meaningful and it still is. And I will share that what one of the early things that I noted about this organization that we were both a part of, because I got to be lucky to join the board at the time when Deepa was the executive director, is, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, people from other faiths or no faith background were coming together and allying and partnering and finding those win-wins where, basically communities were facing a lot of backlash for just being who they were, peaceful people. We were standing up against xenophobia and for rights of immigrants, and really lot of intersectional work was happening as well. So I'm saying a lot here because this has been so meaningful. And Deepa, I just want to start with, that was how I got to know you. And I know you're a very multifaceted person. So we're going to hear more about that today, and how important that type of work is and how applicable it is even today, many years later, in the very unfortunately divided world we're living in. But fortunately, the world that we see where we have a lot of organizations and people of different backgrounds coming together and again allying, supporting each other, and standing up in solidarity. So Deepa, just want to give you a really warm welcome, and if you want to kind of say anything at the outset, please share.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Maheen, for those really kind words and also for recognizing how much people came together during a really tough time in our community's history and in our country's history, to build organizations and to, as you said, deepen partnerships with multiple communities. For me, too, that was a very important time of developing who I am, my identity, my understanding of, myself as a leader and as a community member. And people like you were so, for me, so helpful because, as you mentioned, you were someone who came in from a corporate space, but like completely understood the issues. You had, aligned opinions. You were curious. I remember always thinking that you asked really great questions, right? That we needed to think about, whether it was on a policy topic or how we were doing outreach. And so I really think that it also reminded me that sometimes we can get so siloed. I think only people who, worked in nonprofits can be supportive to nonprofits and movements, and that's not true. And so just want to also recognize you for everything that you gave, not just to SALT, but to other organizations that you've been part of too.
Thank you so much, Deepa. That's really kind of you. And we have an audience, wherever anyone is in the world or in the United States. And I think we want to be able to see that you really, to your point, Deepa, like you don't have to be in a silo. There is no one formula to do X kind of work, fill in the blank, social justice work, economic justice work, environmental work, or anything like that. Really, in fact, some of the most powerful, impactful initiatives and programs happen when people who are different and organizations and communities that are not necessarily doing exactly the same thing actually band together. So I really appreciate that. I do want to share quickly a mini bio of Deepa because, again, like I said, Deepa is multifaceted. And so she is a longtime community builder and storyteller. Her books include We Too Sing America, Social Change Now, and We Are the Builders. Deepa works on solidarity practices and narratives at the Building Movement Project and hosts the Solidarity Is This podcast. And she is the creator of the social change ecosystem framework that is used by individuals and organizations from various sectors. I have actually her social change ecosystem framework guide here that I got. I think it was back in 2022. And so I was looking at it again recently and just, how relevant it is even today in 2026. So I'm sure that we'll touch on some of these themes throughout the conversation today. So I always like to start off with a little bit more about the individual that we're talking to. Jahaan Institute is really focused on bringing us closer together, and really, I think that starts with getting to know each other. And so, Deepa, tell us about yourself. Anything that you want to share about your family, where you grew up, or where you're from, or where you call home.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a question that I often get asked is, why do you do the work you do, right? What shaped you? And I think that the answer to that is multifold, but it does start with my childhood. And so, I am someone who moved to the United States with my family at the age of 12, from Kerala, India to Louisville, Kentucky. And this was in the mid 80s. And so a lot of the feelings around, do I belong here? How do I fit in? What is the racial landscape, right? All these questions were questions that I began to think about even back then, or at least feel them, I should say, right? Feeling excluded, feeling included. And so those experiences have shaped me quite a bit in terms of these larger questions that I think about now and work on now around belonging and solidarity. I think a second big influence for me, as we discussed a little bit, is my identity as a South Asian American in a multiracial country. And so that really got fleshed out for me even more after the attacks of 9/11 and the backlash that followed with the war on terror and the profiling and hate violence that Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh community members experienced. Thinking about ways to respond to that and what my role could be in that moment as someone who held levels of privilege as someone who was a lawyer and someone who was a naturalized citizen, right? So, what does it mean to actually use some of those privileges and those connections to support communities is something that I also thought about quite a bit. And then the third kind of big piece for me is being a mother. And I know we share that in common. We both have teenage boys. And so, being a parent and really coming to terms with, my own, the ways in which I didn't know how to parent, the ways in which I had to learn so much about being a mother, right? Parenting a child in this environment where children of that generation are really inheriting so much crisis. Those three markers have probably been the biggest ones that have shaped me and continue to shape me today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing. And those are all really significant markers. And I can definitely relate on the parenting. And nothing really prepares you for it. I'm sure there are lots of awesome books out there, but as they say, there is no manual. So, Deepa, I know that you have a background in civil rights law. You could have gone in any number of directions. And I think you already started touching on sort of the why behind you chose the direction you chose. Tell us a little bit more about that when you were making, maybe for some of the young people out there who are thinking about their future life paths and decisions, as you were thinking about, let's say, what to study or even what type of law to go into, what informed your thought process?
So, I think that for me, being a lawyer has not been a super important identity. I realized I didn't even mention it, right? When I was just talking about some of the things that have shaped me. I think for me, law school was always sort of a means to an end, which is, I knew that I wanted to learn about the legal history and the legal infrastructure in this country. And I was really interested in classes like constitutional law or employment discrimination or civil rights and immigration issues. And so to me, it has been a way to actually grapple with the ways in which people belong in this country and how they're excluded and what the law has to do with that. So for while I did practice law for a little bit, I see myself more as using the tools of what I learned in different capacities. So I've been able to do a lot of policy advocacy work, whether it's policy research or whether it's legislative advocacy or community awareness around issues related to immigration or national security or civil rights. I've also been able to use my legal background in terms of writing. And that's been a really important part of who I am, and in the types of books that I write. I also teach as an adjunct, and so some of these issues around law and policies often come up in the classes that I teach. So those are ways in which that I've been able to use my legal background, not necessarily to use it to practice law and be a lawyer, but to see it as a versatile tool through which I can actually do some of the variety of things that I'm interested in and to reach audiences in different ways.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. And you mentioned writing. I've got one of your guides right in front of me. I think that you've written a children's book recently and you've written another book a few years ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about your writing?
Yes, I'd love to. Yeah, more recently I've been starting to say I'm a writer. It's something that I never used to say, but I've been trying to come into that identity and not feel so much as an imposter. Um, yeah, writing for me has become almost as a survival tool in this environment, and I think that it always has been. I was reflecting the other day on how I started to write when I was quite young, not very good writing, but when I was like 10, 12. And through my teenage years, I would either like journal or keep a diary all the time, or I would write fiction. And it was a way for me to get all of the stuff in my head out on paper. So it's always been a tool that I lean on. And I didn't actually though publish books until after I turned 40. And so I was writing before, like I would write op-eds or essays, but to actually embark on writing a book and to see it from beginning to end, was something that I didn't actually start until I turned 40. So my first book is called We Too Sing America. It's about the post 9/11 environment. And so it's a lot of it is about the experiences of communities who dealt with, the backlash and profiling that we talked about earlier. And it's very community story centered. So every single chapter begins with people and what they dealt with. And I was really, I think, very fortunate that I was able to build relationships with a lot of the people that I write about. There are people that I've known for a while. There are people I still connected to. So that's the first book. And then many years later, I wrote the book that you referenced, Social Change Now, which is a workbook that is focused on a framework that I put out in 2017 on how we can actually map our social change roles in effective and sustainable ways. And I wrote a kids' picture book on the same topic that came out about a year and a half ago now called We Are the Builders. And it offers young children vocabulary to identify themselves as builders and caregivers and storytellers so that they feel like they're also able to make some sort of change in their communities.
Wow. That's really, really cool. And I think like the impact across the generations is so important. I'm actually curious. I'm gonna try. Like, I'm not a teenager and I'm not, 25, but I'm gonna try to put myself in the shoes of a listener who maybe hasn't lived the experiences of the early days of the post 9/11 America that we're talking about. Um, and really the why behind what a lot of organizations do that are involved in equity work, social justice work, economic justice as well. And if you could share a little bit more just about what maybe you've been seeing in communities across America, what are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities, because I think people want to be seen and heard, and perhaps some of us and leaders like you can be a vessel and a voice for them.
Yeah, I really appreciated how you led into that around young people in this moment. And I've been thinking that about that a lot because I've been doing a lot of workshops and trainings for young people recently, high school through, college. And one of the things that's very obvious is that the understanding of the post 9/11 environment is quite limited. for a lot of young people. And it's not the same as with us, right, who lived it. And clearly they were born after it, but their understanding of it is also limited because there's very little in curricula, in history, social studies, government, where they're hearing about and learning about that moment, other than the horrible attacks that happened and the war in Afghanistan, right? And so there have been studies and research that have looked at the high school curricula, students around the country, schools around the country, and researchers have found that students don't hear about Islamophobia. They don't understand the impact of profiling through immigration laws. They don't, and then what happens is they don't have the critical lens to understand what's happening today. Because when you have the through line of what happened in the wake of 9/11, then you better understand things like the Muslim ban. You better understand things like what we're seeing today, right, in terms of the deportation agenda. So you have a much better understanding, I think, if you can draw the historical through line. So one of the things that I seek to do is to do that, right, whether it's through writing or speaking or training, so that young people get the context that they can say, oh, the Muslim ban has a precedent in special registration that happened after 9/11. Like there are connections here that we can draw. And that helps them to more critically analyze an issue or a policy, figure out how they want to address it, right? And how they want to get involved. So I see myself even more and more being someone who can hopefully translate some of that for young people.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I can see how that would really be eye-opening. I mean, I think everyone can learn from this. And in fact, regardless of what stage or age you're at in life, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on people are so fatigued right now from the polarization, and it's really not from yesterday. It's really been years, actually, and it's just gotten really pronounced. And of course, there's just this intense amount of change happening and the future opportunities around AI safety and ethics issues. You know, what does the near future, not even the later future, look like, right? A lot of things are uncertain. So, with all of that in mind, I wonder what, regardless of whether somebody identifies with being a progressive or conservative or a moderate or centrist, what are, like you said, some of these through lines? What can we learn from where in the United States, or even any examples that you may think of from other parts of the world, as to how we can have uh, a society that has a lot of tolerance, where people can have belonging, where we can be productive people and working towards making it better, right? Rather than sort of this, gosh, I don't know what to do. I feel really fatigued and tired, and I feel helpless, right? So, where's the opportunity, and not so much to paint it as a silver bullet, but really what can we do about it? And what are some of these lessons that we're learning?
Yeah. I heard a couple of questions in that I will try to unpack and address from my little perch in the world. So I think first, this question about polarization, you're so right to point out that it isn't new, right? We've always been a polarized country, period. And I think that we're seeing the polarization be exposed even further right now because of the really cruel and harsh policies that we're seeing coming down the pike, particularly targeting immigrant communities in this moment that we're talking about. I think that one of the couple of the reasons that this is happening, others can talk about this way more eloquently than I, but what I've seen in community spaces is one, I think that the United States' culture of individualism over collective community care is at the root of a lot of this, right? Where we've always been sort of hearing these narratives of like, the nuclear family, or pull yourself up from with your bootstraps, or if you work really hard enough, it's going to work out. And these narratives are extremely challenging because they neglect the fact that we're not super people. We're not going to be able to control all of these things right around us, and that we need a community. So I think that's one of the reasons. A second is I think we do have a failure in empathy. We have this sense of there's a lot of scarcity in this country. Like if I don't if I don't secure my thing for me and my family, then, that's my only goal in life. And there's not enough, this feeling of there's not enough of whatever it is. And I think that makes it harder then to be empathetic with other situations. So I think those are some of the conditions that are leading to the polarization. And then third, we have not as a country reckoned with the historical inequities, the intergenerational inequities of anti-Black racism and white supremacy and anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia. And so, when you have all of that come together, it's not surprising that we're in this space right now. And the second thing I heard you talk about is like, so how do we address that when we feel exhausted and burned out and overwhelmed? And that's really, I think, where this framework that we've been talking about a little bit, the social change ecosystem framework that I developed, could be a potential entry point for folks. What it is basically it offers 10 roles that we can play as individuals or organizations, depending on our capacity and what's needed of us. So, for example, some of the roles in that framework are ones that people feel that they must play all the time, like the frontline responder or the disruptor, where people are like out on the streets, they're rallying, they're protesting. And in the framework that I've developed, when you look at it, you'll see that all the roles are equal and important and valued. And there are other roles like caregiver, healer, visionary, builder, storyteller, experimenter, and weaver. An example of this is during the pandemic when we also saw the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. A lot of people were frontline responders and disruptors, but a lot of people couldn't do that. Maybe they were caring for someone who's immunocompromised, so they couldn't be out on the streets. That didn't mean that they didn't care about issues related to anti-Black racism. It's just that they needed to play a different role. So we saw caregivers who were supporting those who were going out on the front lines, making sure they had water and nutrition. We saw storytellers who got on their platforms to share articles and information about what was happening to combat disinformation. So that's just like an example of how when we are exhausted or overwhelmed, instead of saying, I'm not going to do anything because I can't be the person on the street, right? How can we find other roles that are just as important and necessary for us to play, recognizing what our limits are in terms of our capacity?
I feel like I want to thread a couple of the things you said together, and all of what you said is very interesting. The scarcity mindset, which is definitely all around us. I have felt it. I have to remind myself of abundance, right? And and then, all of these different roles, and even if you are, for whatever reason, no one's judging, not able to be out on the streets in the front lines, there are other roles that people can play. And I wonder what the intersection looks like for people who, sometimes they may be worried in this economy about keeping their job or bouncing back from a layoff, right? So again, back to the scarcity versus abundance mindset. And then what role can I play? Maybe I should really keep quiet, right? Sort of some conversations that I've had with people sort of one-on-one give me a little bit of an inkling that people almost want to say more and do more but have some fears around scarcity. I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you're seeing anything like that.
Totally hit. I mean, you're totally right. You hit the nail on the head. I think that, and I know that, some people feel this even more acutely than others, which is that I've got to keep my job. And if I say something or post something publicly that's critical or I share my opinion, I might actually get attacked or I might be in the spotlight. I think definitely people with precarious immigration statuses or people that, are really concerned about their opinions. I mean, we obviously have seen this, especially around Palestine, and where people have felt like, am I able to say that there is a genocide, right? We should be able to say that. And yet we are seeing examples of people losing their jobs because they say something about a human rights violation. So I think that it's definitely a climate where people have a lot to think about, but that doesn't mean that we just say we do nothing, right? So I want to challenge us and invite us to think about what are the other roles that we can play. So maybe we can't, be the storyteller and put something out publicly, like an
Mhm.
op-ed or a letter to the editor. But what would happen if we played the role of a caregiver and thought about the people in our neighborhood, thought about the people on our school campus, right? And identified ways that we can support those who are marginalized. So there's no hierarchy of social change work or community change work. It's really about finding the roles that fit our current environment and are going to be helpful to the larger ecosystems that we're part of.
Mhm. Yeah, I love these ideas and thoughts from you. Thank you so much for sharing, Deepa. And, I think we'd be remiss, it's February 2026 if we didn't mention Minneapolis, right? I know you tend to have a really good finger on the pulse. At least I am not as connected with some of the local communities. I don't know if you have anything that you want to share. What are you observing? It's been challenging. In fact, it's even been unsafe to be in the front lines for some people, and we are grateful for their sacrifices. And so what are you seeing in terms of all these different roles that people can play or are playing in places like Minneapolis? Are you seeing any of that
Oh
happening?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been lucky enough that, I have heard from and been in touch with people who are taking on so much in places like Minneapolis, and also want to lift up, Washington, D.C., which has been occupied and continues to be, and Los Angeles. I think one of the things that I noticed specifically in Minneapolis is actually the groundwork that had happened after the murder of George Floyd in the community there led people to build a lot of deep relationships. And they were able to continue those relationships. So when this horrific moment happened with the surge of immigration enforcement there, they were able to already rely on some of those trusted relationships. They weren't having to make them again anew. And I think that's one of the lessons learned, where when you're able to build that infrastructure and those relationships after a crisis, and you can continue it because you it has been invested in, you're putting time into it, then when the next crisis comes up, it can be you're able to pivot, right, and lean on those relationships and infrastructure. So that's something that I've learned. I think a second is just the way in which folks in Minneapolis have been really great about messaging, right, and talking about their families, their communities, on that immigrant communities are part of their history. Refugee communities, the Somali community, the Hmong community, they're part of their histories in Minneapolis, right? And I think that it's not like this sort of they're different or they're separate, but they're really part of the community. And I think that has been something that we can all learn as well.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Ultimately, there is always hope, and there's so much important work happening. I can't say everything on social media is negative. I actually get a lot of good information, and there's some pretty stuff that's hard to see. You mentioned Palestine. We're talking about what's happening right here in the United States. Regardless of any beliefs that we may have, challenges that we may face or have faced in our own family or sort of our own kind of ancestry, if you will. I think there are ways that we can come together. And back to the word that you use, it's really powerful: empathy, compassion, and have that for each other. And I really hope that we can find a way forward. So, that is more about building and rebuilding from this really difficult time that we're in. I personally can't think of such a moment in a really, really long time, if ever, in my lifetime as
Yeah,
this right now.
I
Mhm.
agree. I think it's definitely, I mean, the post 9/11 moment, as we've discussed several times,
Yeah.
was incredibly challenging because we didn't have the infrastructure, right? Like we didn't have listservs, we didn't have organizations. We were kind of starting everything from scratch in some of the communities. So it's felt triply difficult. But I think you're absolutely right that right now, folks use this word polycrisis to define what's happening. these overwhelming, overlapping crises that are occurring right now makes this moment even more challenging. But even you, and I want you to talk about this too. Like I've seen you like really clarify and identify the role that you play in community, right? With like supporting refugee families and making sure that folks have access to basic survival needs. These are like such important pieces of infrastructure to create. And so
Mm.
you've been playing the role of a builder, a caregiver, and I would say a weaver to connect, different communities to marginalized family members, for example, and different resources to them. So I want to hear. I think you should
Mm.
say a little bit too, because you've been building that for quite some time.
I appreciate that, Deepa. I think everything has led to everything else, right? And that's how life is, right? So whether it's being in a corporate environment and getting to do work with community groups and industry and sort of seeing the policy landscape, the strategic reasons that an organization may do things, whatever those are, as well as being able to sort of do the good on the ground. I have learned so much. I grew up in different countries and I came to the US as a college student and then became an American along the way in the future. And I'm still learning. I will say I knew very little about indigenous communities until I did the work that I talked about very briefly in the US. And when you start to learn, you work with Black communities, Asian American, Indigenous and Native American, Latino communities, rural white communities, women, LGBTQ plus, fill in the blank. Like there are so many different underserved groups. And when you start to really see that there actually is quite a bit in common, and then there's some really unique challenges that they may face, I think you see some things that are transferable, if you will, right, from one group to another. And sometimes, if you even tap people who are really committed to the work, yourself included, I really want to thank you for that. When the Afghan community came in the recent wave after the 20-year war, and was resettled by the federal government of the United States, about 80,000 people across the US, including the Washington, D.C. area, with little, if anything, in terms of belongings or financial access. I have to thank a coworker who was doing volunteer work who introduced me to a grassroots small organization, right? And that is probably what you're alluding to is just what can we do to just step up and help people who don't have a meal today, who don't have furniture in the apartment that they did just get access to, but with no, job, no nothing. And so I think it's just this interesting mix of sort of seeing the bird's eye view, right, of all these different communities and the work that's been done over decades, if not longer, and the impact that and the shoulders that we're all standing on, right? So the civil rights leaders of the 1960s, right? 1970s, and how we've built up to where we are now, and how our future generations are going to be building and making things stronger and better from where we are. So I appreciate you asking me, and I think that's what makes me tick and want to have these conversations is I'm around people who have very different, and I'm sure you are too, political views or even are apolitical. They don't even want to get into politics. And I respect them, I respect all of that. And I just want for all of us, no matter what our beliefs or thought processes are or philosophies, if we can all see that we have the agency to be a part of the solution, right? Somehow, in some way, that is powerful. We are not helpless and don't have to be sort of in reaction to what's going on around us. And so this is why I really love your framework because there is a role that everyone can play. And you've already thrown out three just at me or about me. Like more than one is doable too, or you could change over time, right? So
Yes,
yeah.
you can absolutely change over time and should. Yeah. But I think that, one of the things that I also want to uplift about you, not to kind of put you, make you feel embarrassed, is I think that you are also someone who has modeled what it means to be in corporate America and still be connected to community and have a lot of humility when you're in spaces to listen and to learn rather than to say, like, this is what I think, right? And I think you model some of those behaviors that are so important, because, social change or community care work is not and should not be relegated to like just nonprofits or to political leaders, right? It needs to be something that's everyone's business. It isn't something that we're like, oh, well, let's let the charismatic leader handle that, or let's let the elected person handle it, or the nonprofit here handle it. I think
Mhm.
that when we silo it like that, then we get further away from some of the concepts we've discussed around empathy and collective care. So the real question, I think, is like, no matter where I sit, what can I do? What roles can I play to support the issues I care about,
Mhm.
and the communities I care about? What would be helpful to them, right? If I bring in my privileges, my positionality, my platforms, my money, my resources, my ideas, what could be helpful? And I think that each of us has, as you said, that role to play and can do it. And I've seen that honestly, everywhere. Like people are always kind of organizing their roles and figuring it out. And so are young kids, like I know that if young children who are reading my book can say, I'm a weaver, and can understand that and recognize that in themselves, then all that takes, right, is then to put that energy into a particular issue or an ecosystem or a community. And then we'll see that magic happen. So
Mhm.
I think it's really important that we don't kind of take ourselves out of it because we're in corporate America or we're too young or we're too old or whatever, or
Mhm.
we've been burned by the nonprofit sector. I think it's important to kind of recalibrate again and again if we care about these issues.
Thank you, Deepa. Thank you for your kind words. And also, I will say some of it is about you don't know what you don't know, and it's about being curious, right? So when I even look back at, like, I have an MBA, so I could have, like you, with your law degree, right? I could have gone in different directions, and I can still go in different directions. I've worked for a very large nonprofit. I've supported in some volunteer capacity smaller nonprofits, and then I've been in the Fortune 500. And so when I look back, had it not been for a serendipitous opportunity to join a team that was working with underserved communities and industry, and when I say and industry, I'm talking about in the sort of mainstream for-profit industry and some of the powerhouses in Washington, D.C., and around the country here in the U.S., you just being able to go to the conferences and then in the communities. So if there was a conference that then took you into the local community, into the neighborhoods, and then you had the locals talking to you about how they're using art as a form of, expression and social justice or what have you, fill in the blank. I learned so much from that, right? So while I had my aspirations and I thought I had everything figured out as a relatively young person back then, I just had so much more to learn. And I think if we can just, myself included, take away that be curious, those contacts, those connections, people like yourself, Deepa, multiple other people that I can name who I've been able to tap on the shoulder and just say, hey, I'm doing a work as a volunteer in the DC area for refugees. I'm trying to figure out if there is a way to connect the dots, not only locally, but at the national advocacy level to, let's say, the broader space of advocating for, immigrant communities and refugee communities. And, you've said more than, yes, I can put you in touch with someone, or I can give you some thoughts, or, some advice. And I've taken that back, right? So we can play all kinds of roles. I'm completely disagreeing with what you're saying, and you just don't know what you are capable of and what your network, the people that your connections are willing to do.
Absolutely. And I think, curiosity is a really important stance. Humility, is another one that it's important to take, seeing the patterns, being self-aware, and saying, oh, okay, I see that there's a need that continually comes up in this particular community. What can I do with the access that I might have, right, to address this? And people, you've done that in different ways. People do that all the time. And I think it's just important to know that we do have some level of agency. There's this quote that I love. I'm going to probably not get it right, but it's a quote that says, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. And that's by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And I think it does a wonderful job of saying, like, we're not trying to fix the whole world.
Mhm.
We are trying to actually, put our hand out and see what do we have some level of connection to. Maybe that's our neighborhood. Maybe it is a task force and an academic institution that we might be part of. Maybe it's a mutual aid association. Maybe it's an online community, a digital community space. But whatever it is that is close into us, how do we impact that, right? By playing different roles that can support and change the way in which we interact with each other, and hopefully the systemic issues that exist.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that quote and bringing it home literally and figuratively. Wherever we can make our impact is good. And so as we wrap up today, would love to just get the outlook from you. You're doing so many really cool things. What are you excited about in the rest of 2026? What's coming up for you, Deepa?
On a personal level, I am really looking forward to spending more time on my writing practice. That's really important to me, as I had shared before. And so, really thinking about using writing as a way to convey ideas and also tools, practical tools that can be used, and preserving histories. So, I think those are the things that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, how can I use writing to, in this age of erasure, to document and preserve histories and experiences? So that's something that I think about a lot, and I'm looking forward to spending some more time on. And then I'm also really, thinking about how to continue to like thinking about parenting. And we talked about this before we even started. We both have teenage kids, right? And so that is something that's always on my mind: how to support my son, how to be kind of a guide. That's another role on the map, like how to play the role of a guide. And which also means you have to let go a bit, right? Like you can't
Yeah.
you can't like be like the savior or the protector all the time. So I'm practicing letting go, and practicing some level of confidence that my son will, that he's okay, right? And so those are some of the things that are constantly on my mind and that I'm thinking about at a personal level. And then
Mhm.
broadly beyond that, I'm really excited about continuing to support different organizations that I'm either part of, working in, or that are local in the DC area. That's really important to me. So leaning into more community spaces where we can be building together.
That sounds really exciting. And I do love the theme of the being the guide, letting go, and sort of, kind of being at peace with all of that. And it actually can be taken up to the macro level too, right? Again,
Yeah.
we can't save the world, any of us individually, but we can make a difference and we can be guides or take on a different role in change making. So those are awesome themes. So, last question as we finish up today: how can people find you? So, you've mentioned you have your podcast, you've written these books, and I know that you work in an organization setting and often do workshops and speaking or whatever it is that you'd like to share with everyone on how people can find you.
Yes. So if folks are curious and intrigued by the social change ecosystem framework that we've discussed, the best place to go for that is socialchangemap.com. It's a hub of information about the framework, and also includes links to the books that we've mentioned and talked about as well, and free resources like conversation guides and worksheets. And then in terms of the work that I do on solidarity practice, The website is solidarityis.org. And there are a lot of resources there that the amazing team that I work with have developed that people can use, like practice guides for organizations and for networks around solidarity. So that's another place. You'll also find links to the podcast that I mentioned earlier, Solidarity is This, on that website as well.
Awesome. Well, I just wrote those down. We'll make sure we get those out to everyone. Deepa, it's been so good talking to you. I feel like we could have done this for another hour, gone in any kind of direction. This has been so great. Learned so much from you. And again, appreciate everything you do because you're really humble and you didn't say a lot, but about what you do. Deepa is a powerhouse, everyone. So please do look her up, check her out. And again, I can't think of a better time for the social change framework that I'm looking at because it's super applicable all the time and especially now. So thank you, Deepa. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you so much for having me, Maheen.
Anytime. Have a great day.